contemporary of Weber and Durkheim, though his long life meant that he was active well beyond the 1890-1920 period identified as the foundational moment of sociological theory. Du Bois's first major work was a survey and ethnographic study, The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899. The migration of African Americans from the southern states following the Civil War and the failure of Reconstruction exposed them to de facto prejudice in northern cities, equivalent to the legalized discrimination of the South. This was a prejudice that was already experienced by long-standing communities of free African Americans present in these cities. Tocqueville had described the situation of mingled races in the US as impossible. Du Bois, however, had to live it, and, in living it, he made it central to the development of his sociological inquiries and political commitments. Alongside his scholarly work, Du Bois was also active in politics in a variety of roles, including as one of the founders of the civil rights organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and was editor of its monthly magazine, The Crisis. He was a delegate to the newly established United Nations in the 1940s, involved in Pan-African congresses, and was an anti-war activist for much of his later life. Du Bois had had an ambivalent attitude to the First World War and US involvement in it. Unlike Weber, who was a staunch advocate for the national cause, Du Bois regarded participation in the war as necessary to the furtherance of African American claims for equal citizenship. They should participate as Americans, and as participants, should be granted the same rights and respect as other citizens. His experience of the failure of this strategy took him in more radical directions, including towards pacifism. Du Bois, as we shall see, would connect black interests to saving white and black, in contrast to white sociologists and their positive orientation to colonialism and empire. In The Philadelphia Negro, Du Bois addressed the long-standing presence of African Americans in the city. The questions that organised the study were posed both in terms of determining the real condition of the group, including its internal stratifications, and how the group was shaped by its physical and social environment. Du Bois was concerned to establish from the outset that, and I quote, "a slum is not a simple fact, it is a symptom," and that every group has its upper class. He sought to dispel the common-sense understandings prevalent at the time that saw simple poverty as the natural condition of African Americans, and to point to the social conditions of poverty as well as to the diversity of classes within African Americans as a group. The Philadelphia Negro was the first empirical sociological study of a specific group within the US. Even though this accolade is usually given to Thomas and Zaniecki's study of the Polish peasant, which was published 20 years later. As sociologists are increasingly beginning to recognize, US sociology did not begin in the University of Chicago in the 1920s, but at the universities of Pennsylvania and Atlanta in the 1890s. In 1910, Du Bois accepted the position of Director of Publicity and Research at the newly formed National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, leading to a more politically active phase of his career. This period of activism involved an increasing recognition by him of the need to associate the struggle for emancipation in the US with global struggles for emancipation from colonial rule. He also retained his commitment to scholarship, which would culminate in his major study, Black Reconstruction. The work for what would become Du Bois's magnum opus, Black Reconstruction, had in fact begun a quarter of a century earlier with a paper he presented at the American Historical Association in 1909 titled Reconstruction and Its Benefits. Up to this time, the dominant understanding of the period after the Civil War within mainstream historiography was that Reconstruction had failed precisely because the suffrage had been extended too quickly to African Americans and that Southern institutions had been unjustly dismantled. This historiography, which has come to be associated with the Dunning School, though it has a wider provenance, was critical of post-Civil War federal actions as a tyrannical overreach into white society, especially with regard to the amelioration of the position of African Americans. Such understandings were central to the subsequent implementation of new forms of segregation and subordination of African Americans, the so-called Jim Crow laws, that would last until the civil rights period of the 1960s. Du Bois was clear that Reconstruction had not been a failure, but that it had been opposed and subverted, and that subversion had become the historiographic norm. Du Bois put forward three key benefits of Reconstruction, namely that it had brought about democratic government, that it established free public schools, and that it provided for new social legislation that addressed poverty across communities, that is, across the colour line. This argument was expanded and developed more fully in Black Reconstruction. Published in 1935, it represented, as Lewis notes, one of those genuine paradigm shifts periodically experienced in a field of knowledge. In the book, Du Bois challenged every problematic claim made within the dominant scholarship of the time about Reconstruction, and argued strongly for recognition of the contribution made by African Americans to reconstruct democracy during this period. Black Reconstruction gave voice to this silenced history. By writing the chief witness of Reconstruction, the emancipated slave, back into the history of the period, Du Bois did not simply wish to add another narrative to the general history of Reconstruction. Rather, he sought to point to this studied absence and, in reconstructing history, also work to reconstruct the nation and democracy. Black Reconstruction stands as both a contribution to a more adequate history of the period and an attempt, as Du Bois wrote, to establish truth on which right in the future may be built, and a challenge to the racialized historiography of earlier accounts. It forcefully presented an argument for scholars to, and I quote, regard the truth as more important than the defense of the white race. Scholarship on the period of Reconstruction may now be transformed, not least as a consequence of an appreciation of Du Bois's contribution. However, there was a further, broader aim to Du Bois's work, an aim that is focused on social theory and its narratives as much as historiography. Du Bois wished Reconstruction, as well as its prehistory of the mass transportation of human beings and their enslavement, to be understood as, and I quote, an upheaval of humanity like the Reformation and the French Revolution. That is, as what Weber would have called a world historical event. Du Bois resigned from the NAACP in 1934, returning a decade later to coordinate its global efforts, particularly in the area of anti-colonialism. From presenting the colour line as the defining issue for humanity in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, by 1945, in Colour and Democracy, Du Bois suggested that the abolition of colonialism should be considered the most profound issue requiring address. From at least since the time of his participation at the Universal Races Congress in London in 1911, Du Bois had argued for the need to consider, and I quote, the disenfranchisement of American Negroes, the subjection of India, and the partition of Africa within a common framework of analysis predicated on the solidarity of peoples of colour. In Colour and Democracy, he demonstrated a keen understanding of the broader histories of colonialism and the extractive relationships through which colonizing countries had not only existed, but thrived. Du Bois was prescient in his analysis of the ways in which the colonial organization of the world was also implicated in the situation of the working classes in colonizing countries, and vice versa. He wrote that when working people within European countries began to demand costly social improvements from their governments, the financial burdens of this were likely to be balanced by increased investment in and extraction from the colonies. In this way, democracy in Europe and America, he argued, will continue to impede and nullify democracy in Asia and Africa. The problem of democracy, he stated, was located in the poverty in which the majority of people live. The poverty of those who had been colonized, the poverty of the smaller nations, and also the poverty within colonizing countries. Until these issues were addressed across the board, he wrote, there can be no satisfactory development of the democratic ideal. The tradition of sociology inaugurated by Du Bois provided a significant challenge to dominant understandings of race and of race relations in the US, with broader implications globally. In particular, Du Bois contested otherwise dominant sociological arguments that sought to explain the unequal conditions within which African Americans found themselves in terms either of the biological differentiation of races or of a cultural deficit. Instead, he argued for race to be understood as a product of prejudice, racism, with associated material injustices of poverty, degradation, systematic oppression, and segregation. David Levering Lewis, in the conclusion of his biography of Du Bois, notes that over his long career, Du Bois had, and I quote, attempted virtually every possible solution to the problem of 20th century racism: scholarship, propaganda, integration, cultural and economic separatism, politics, international communism, expatriation, third world solidarity. At each turn, Du Bois confronted the enduring nature of the color line, but he did not give way to pessimism.